Today for Devotions with Daniella, we are reading from Generation Hope, How Inclusive Economics Can Help Us All Thrive. As our economy is crashing, maybe we read about a different model. I am reading this a little bit every day for my own process of deconstructing the bad stuff I was taught, and if you're interested, you can get copies attached here. After several decades when general welfare increased, over the last 2 decades, the 1% have left the rest of us behind. Most of this is attributed to choices made by governments, which begs the question, what if we made different policies? Despite prevailing narratives, there are genuine pathways for inclusive economics to include everyone. One consideration that catalytic governments could make is universal basic services, or UBS. Unlike the more widely discussed universal basic income, UBS denotes a wide range of free public services enabling every citizen to meet their basic needs and achieve certain levels of security, opportunity, and participation. And I always say, the reason Mr. Nitty and Cult Lady and I have the life that we do is a testament to universal income. We get disability and retirement money from the government just for waking up, universal health care, and universal education. We do it for veterans. Not well, but we do it. Why can't we do it for everyone else? We did it during COVID. We fed all school children during COVID, all of them. And then we just stopped. The core principles of UBS are universal, guaranteed entitlement according to one's need, not ability to pay. Basic, sufficient rather than minimal, enabling people to meet their basic needs, participate in society, and flourish. Services, collectively generated activities that serve the public interest. UBS typically are a collection of 7 free public services that enable every citizen to live a larger life by ensuring access to safety, opportunity, and participation. These are shelter, food, healthcare, education, transportation, information, and legal services. I really feel like childcare needs to be in there. If a woman wrote this book, it probably would be. Drawing on Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs, which we should say he stole from the Blackfoot people and corrupted. Universal access to basic services is one way to guarantee a minimum standard of living. By meeting people's physiological needs, food, water, and shelter, and providing them with safety and security, we provide a strong foundation for self-esteem and community building. A platform of basic services makes the real promise that a basic income pretends to deliver. Further, advocates for UBS highlight that focusing on more comprehensive provision of services rather than only giving cash handouts preserves a strong incentive for citizens to work, while the state takes care of those who cannot work. If we were to give everyone a UBI, Universal Basic Income, where we need UBS, advocates for UBS argue that for certain goods, direct provision by the state has advantages that cash transfers or UBI cannot compete with. One reason is that cash transfers may not be enough to cover needs. The amount of health care or social care someone needs varies wildly over the course of one's life and from person to person in ways that are unpredictable. Given this, if everyone were given an equal amount of cash payment, the outcome would be unequal, as those with high needs would be unable to cover the cost of their care. As we saw in Chapter 1, the NHS isn't without its flaws and is in need of major reform to make it more efficient. But one only has to look at the U.S. healthcare system to see the dangers of for-profit private provision. President Obama attempted to tackle the issues of unequal needs by providing more universal and subsidized access to insurance with the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, colloquially known as Obamacare. A decade later, it is now embedded in the healthcare system, roughly halving, cutting in half the uninsured share of the population, especially by preventing premiums from going up due to pre-existing conditions and addressing affordability for freelance workers. However, Obamacare did not change the structural ownership at the heart of healthcare. As a result, resources are channeled toward where the money is rather than toward the needs. When healthcare is provided for profit, there are huge incentives at play. Hospitals overtreat or prioritize the most lucrative treatments and stick insurance companies with the bill. Of course, insurance companies are for profit too, and so they price it into premiums, which is why health insurance remains so expensive in the US. In the post-war era, many countries, including the US, in spite of its resistance to universal health care, moved toward what was previously known as the welfare state. In the UK, for example, the NIH was born in 1948, providing free universal health care. Prior to the NIH, patients were generally required to pay for their health care. Free treatment was sometimes available from charitable volunteer hospitals. Concessionary travel schemes were introduced to provide free travel on public transport for kids under 11, residents of cities who were age 60 and over, now 66, or those who have a disability. Social housing, also known in the US as low-income or affordable housing, boomed in the 50s and 60s, with mixed socioeconomic housing throughout the country. Even today, social housing exists in Chelsea right next to the Billionaires Row, though, as you would expect, much has changed in the last few decades. Social house building in England is at its lowest rate in decades. Since 1991, there has been an average annual net loss of 24,000 social homes, resulting in 1.4 million fewer households in social housing than there were in 1980. Free education was introduced in the late 19th century and remains free for primary and secondary state schools today. Up until 1998, it was free to go to university too. Now there's a fixed fee of around $11,000 per year for all courses. Food banks and legal aid services are available to citizens around the country, provided by both local councils and charities. The problem in the UK is that other than the NHS and the state school system, none of the other basic services are universal. The NHS is the pride of the nation and there's no stigma attached to using it. And by large, that is true for state schools too. But that is not the case with the other services, which are means tested, difficult to access, and a signal that you can't afford something independently. Equally, many who desperately need these services are ashamed to request them or don't know how to. A closer look at funding to the NHS shows that since 1979 to 1980, the budget has grown fourfold in real terms and has doubled its share of the GDP. However, at the same time, the population has grown by 10.6 million. Spending per person has not grown as fast as the total spend. And it's not only the population headcount that has changed. So too has the demographic structure. In particular, the number of older people has grown, both in absolute terms and also as a proportion of the total population. Why can't a rich country like the UK fund the NHS adequately? It comes down to policy. The Conservative government came to power in 2010, believing in a smaller government, lower taxes, and less government spending, and introduced austerity measures that reduced the capacity of the NHS over the following decade. Real term spending increases per head averaged just 0.4% a year and included 4 years in which spending per head actually fell. It was a period of stagnation in terms of the resources available to the NHS to fund improvements in healthcare quality. It should come as no surprise that Conservatives hollowed out the NHS, but it was even worse than expected. The Boris Johnson Brexit bus lie that the NHS would get an extra 350 million a week was one of the most contentious issues of the 2016 EU referendum campaign. Obviously, none of that money went where it was said it would. We went from clapping for the NHS during the pandemic to unprecedented strikes by junior doctors and nurses due to the cost of living crisis post-pandemic, causing over 500,000 patient appointments to be rescheduled. After years of underinvestment, the Conservatives have finally committed to increase spending by $13.2 billion in cash, although rising prices will cut this to around $2.4 billion. In 2023, the opposition leader, Keir Starmer, unveiled Labour's mission to create an NHS fit for the future. But we'll just have to wait and see how that affects how people vote. Even so, as we saw at the end of Chapter 4, restricting our responsibility to just the ballot box and leaving the rest, even to the most progressive government, isn't going to solve our problems. And keeps going for a little bit, but we're going to run out of time. Check out Generation Hope, How Inclusive Economics Can Help Us All Thrive.